Welcome to the Sales Scholars, where we talk to academic experts about anything and everything sales related. Our goal is to bring some of the top academic research in the world of selling and deliver it here to you in practical, easy to apply methods that can improve your business.
Well, welcome to this episode of the Sales Scholars podcast. We are excited to have Dr. Luci Beeler from Ohio University with us. Now, Lisa is an assistant professor and the Director of Diversity and Inclusion and Internships for the Ralph and Luci Schey Sales Center. So, Lisa, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, no, it's great. I always enjoy conversations with academics for sure. And then, we had one of your colleagues on here in the past, Dr. Rapp.
Oh, yeah.
And he's entertaining.
He is. We have a lot of energy in the Schey Cell Center, that's for sure.
Yes, that's awesome. Well, look, one of the things I always like to kick off the show with is just learning a little bit more about our guests. So maybe share with us, how in the world did you get into the academic world?
Sure. So I always like to say it was either by accident or by fate one. I'm not really sure. But I'm actually a first generation college student from Appalachia. So I'm from East Tennessee, and neither of my parents went to college, of course. And education, though, was always highly valued in our family. So I think it was the mindset of as much as you can get, go get it. So I was raised with that mentality. So it's not necessarily a huge surprise that I'm in education, but it's kind of a windy path. So my undergrad is from Tennessee. I went on a scholarship specifically for counties that are impoverished in Appalachia. I'm super grateful for that. And then after undergrad, I went to law school for a year and dropped out. So I'm officially a law school dropout. And then I went to the University of Kentucky for my master's. And after that, I was pretty done with school for a while. And however, terrible timing. It was 2008. So trying to find a job in 2008 with a master's degree and no experience really was pretty much impossible. So I came upon a job as a marketing coordinator in Atlanta, Georgia. And I love to tell my students this, I made $28,000 in my first job, and they all die that, how did you survive? But I made $28,000 in my first job. And I just kind of landed in sales through the marketing kind of channel, right? Like I started as a marketing coordinator. I met a random person at a bar that told me about this awesome marketing and sales job that another B2B company had to open. I applied for it, had it a few days later, and that really gave me kind of the jumping off point regarding the sales domain and the sales world. I was helping run the CRM system. I was the national marketing and sales director who worked under the VP of business development. So I loved that job. Loved. It was an awesome place to work. I absolutely adored sales. I would have never known anything about it. Oh, and a side note, I am from the South. So my students always joke that they love the way I say sales. And my joke is always, well, up here, I have to clarify. No, I don't work in biology, but in the South, everybody hears what I'm saying. But
I have no problem with it. So.
Okay, perfect. So I loved working in sales in Atlanta, but my parents being a little bit older, my dad's health started to fail, and my family is as tight as they come. And I had to figure out a way to go back to Tennessee to be there for them. And education is my default. I love to learn. So I applied to one PhD program because I knew if I couldn't go there that I was going to stay in Atlanta. And I did end up at the University of Tennessee, an awesome program. I worked under a gentleman named Alex Zabla, who was very helpful in helping me carve out sales research, because even though it's been around a long time, I think there's still a small group of us, and it's still kind of a hard area to work in. And then after my PhD, Dr. Adam Rapp recruited me up to Ohio University, which of course I'm biased, but is one of the best sales programs in the country. And it just feels like this long journey, this twist and turn, and kind of life led me to where I'm supposed to be, but I had nothing to do with it. It was complete accident. But I can't imagine a better job.
That's great. You know what? Your story, when I think about it, I mean, you had like every component of like a great movie. I mean, even to the part where you said, well, I met this person in a bar,
Yeah.
Entertainment, but then you got the family story, you got the education story. I mean, it has definitely, it sounds like, been quite an experience. But and we're obviously familiar with the work that you guys do, and love it. And we love the fact that the more people that are out there educating students and helping prepare them for the future, the better,
Sure.
especially in sales.
Yeah,
Because there's so
absolutely.
much opportunity.
Yeah, I think it's so important. Me myself as a naive PhD student, I just assumed everywhere trained students to be salespeople. And then it took me a while to realize, like, oh, there's a lot of universities that you can't even take a sales class. So, yeah, right now, statistically, from what we understand, 40% of college students end up in some sort of sales role. And if you come out of the College of Business, it could be as high as 80%. So it's awesome to be in an organization that has been thinking about this since the 90s.
And you and I had a chance to talk about a lot of different topics before the show, but I remember one in particular when we were talking about the psychological momentum in selling. And I know you've done some research in that space and how psychological momentum impacts salespeople. So maybe just let's talk a little bit about what you mean by that concept, and then why salespeople and sales leaders need to understand it.
Sure, absolutely. So this is some work that I've done with colleagues from Florida State University, University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, and also the University of Alabama. The idea of psychological momentum. So a lot of us know it in the sports setting. Sometimes it's called like the hot hand fallacy, right? That somebody shoots a shot and they nail it, and then all of a sudden they go on a streak, right? They keep hitting shots over and over and over and over. Well, myself, I can remember this happening in the sales world, right? I had people working with me that it would be like they didn't get a single deal closed for months, and then all of a sudden they got four, right? And granted, where I used to work, it was a parking services company, so it was a longer sales cycle. But there would literally, be a long time, and then all of a sudden it's like they just kept hitting, like they just kept closing deals over and over and over. So I started thinking about this idea in the sales domain. So do salespeople actually experience this momentum in the sense of I want a deal, I'm feeling good, I'm feeling confident, and it actually influences whether you win the next deal, and it, on and on and on, right? So the specific context we wanted to look at was the idea of really thinking about future opportunities, because salespeople spend a lot of time thinking about, okay, I have a leads list, let's say of 100 people. I know some folks are dealing with leads lists of thousands of people, but let's say 100 people. Having to prioritize how you're going to spend your time that day, right? That's a huge part of being a good salesperson. So as salespeople make these assessments, let's say that I decide that I want to focus on a certain client today. There's resources allocated to that. There's time allocated to that. And we know that a lot of times we get it wrong. Like as salespeople, we focus on the wrong people. We don't close deals that we thought we were going to close, right? We have a
Yeah.
hard time really forecasting if we're going to close a deal or not. So what we wanted to explore is what affects that decision making process. And specifically, the psychological momentum literature talks about confidence and overconfidence and optimism. So we wanted to look at how that actually biases how likely salespeople are to think that they're going to close some opportunity that they can work on. Now, an interesting thing that we also want to look at is sales managers. So are sales managers better at this? Can they actually more accurately predict whether their sales team is going to close a certain deal or not? So what we found that is interesting is that yes, salespeople tend to be more confident, more optimistic, and even harmfully overconfident when it comes to thinking that they're going to close certain deals. But what really drives that is what they recall. So as a salesperson, when I have to make these decisions, I am actually more likely to recall my wins, which isn't surprising, right?
Yeah.
We have friends who are still talking about high school wins that they had, right? So we love to recall our wins. So salespeople are more likely to recall wins. So that psychological momentum starts to kick in. They recall a win. They're like, oh, yeah, I got this. I'm going to close this one, I'm sure, right? Sales managers are actually more likely to recall a nice buffet of past experiences. So they are more likely to recall some wins, some similar losses, right? And be able to actually forecast better whether someone is going to close a sale or not. Something also that's interesting is salespeople focus on the size of the opportunity. So another reason that maybe they're biased and their projections are bigger is the whole rainbow chasing or big fish, right? They get obsessed with the idea of future rewards. So let's say that there's a huge commission attached to some potential opportunity. The salesperson is more likely to focus on that and be more confident that they're able to close that deal. Whereas a sales manager does not just consider the size of the deal, but they're actually better at thinking about a lot of different other factors. So ultimately, I think what's important is that managers recognize that salespeople tend to have biases that impact their decision making on how likely it is they're going to close sales. I think a lot of times salespeople sales managers give salespeople a lot of freedom to prioritize exactly who they're going to be reaching out to, who they're going to be spending their time and resources on. I think this is an area where sales managers could step in and kind of be a balance, a check and balance to really help the salesperson kind of put a stake in a more likely kind of area and say, well, yeah, maybe you're going to close it, but let's think through all the different kind of similar situations you've been in where you've lost and won. Let's think about more things besides the size of the deal, like maybe even giving them a buffet of factors to be thinking about or a set of factors to be thinking about just to help them really assess the opportunity at a better level. So that's kind of the gist of what we did. But I think it's something that I saw a lot of. I still see a lot of it. I'm still the same way with research. If I get a publication hit, I'm like, all right, the next one's going to hit. Like I feel it, right?
Yeah.
So tempering those expectations and making sure that salespeople are prioritizing their opportunities appropriately, I think is an area that a lot of managers and salespeople should be considering.
Gotcha. And so in that area of kind of tempering it, because um, so my wife labels me and our family as like she's really optimistic and adventurous, and so she'll want to do things, and then I'll be like, well, we can't, or this, that. She's called me the dream crusher sometimes, and it makes me, and I'm like, well, I'm not crushing dreams. I'm just trying to deal with reality, but. I'm thinking about this scenario as a sales manager, and I'm thinking, okay, hey, how can I, as a sales manager, both temper, as you described, but then also make sure that my salesperson maintains the appropriate level of confidence and optimism around what they're going to experience. Like, have you seen any practices with managers that you thought were pretty helpful?
So I think there's a couple best practices. I think it's important to provide specific guidelines in the sense of, like I said, maybe you provide for all of your sales team an actual list of like when you're prioritizing deals, you need to think about, yes, the size of the opportunity. Absolutely. Maybe you need to be considering how close, you know, let's say the contact of whoever you're speaking with, who are they in the buying center? You can talk through all these different factors because when you do that, it doesn't turn into a personal attack, right? That it's like, well, you shouldn't be so overconfident. Like you
Yeah.
should temper yourself. Instead, it's, hey, let's talk about how to make an educated and well informed decision in regards to the likelihood of closing the sale.
Yeah. Oh, that's really helpful. Well, look, Lisa, I know that when I introduced you and I was talking about your title, I know I had mentioned that you're director of diversity and inclusion,
Mhm.
and as you know, as a topic that is extraordinarily hot today, lots of conversation about it, and the sales discipline in particular, I think, like a lot of fields, is being challenged to kind of rethink how they approach diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, what do you think it related to that is important for sales teams to understand about the topic, and what steps can they take to advance it in their companies?
Sure, absolutely. So I think this area is something that, like you said, I don't think it's an option anymore to think about whether, as a sales manager or someone hiring or even a company, you can't sit back and be like, do we want to do this? I think now the question is, how do we do this? And I think that's awesome. So I was recruited to the Schey specifically to do diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. So just for folks that maybe this isn't their area, let me just define those terms a little bit so we know the domain we're working in. So in my perspective, short and sweet, diversity is getting diverse people on your team. Inclusion is making sure that those folks feel like part of your team. And equity is providing the appropriate resources to make sure that your team members can be successful. And sometimes that means that different team members actually need different resources. I think about, like I said earlier, I went to college on a scholarship that was specifically for people that live in counties that are below poverty line in Appalachia. That may be seen as unfair that I was able to access that scholarship. But in my opinion, that's a perfect example of equity, like providing someone that might not have the resources, the appropriate resources to be successful. So that's kind of what we're talking about. And I think it's also important to talk about whether it's a moral or financial issue. So for me, it's a moral issue, first and foremost. And I think a lot of people are on board with that. I teach a diversity, equity, and inclusion course in the College of Business that really focuses on how do you think about these initiatives from a business perspective. So for me, the foundation's moral. Maybe someone doesn't buy that. Maybe some people will never buy that. It doesn't matter. It's still financial. There's all kinds of research that shows that diverse teams are more innovative. Diverse teams bring in more money. Diverse teams solve problems quicker. I mean, there's just so many positive financial things that come from diversity, equity, inclusion. So with that being said, kind of laying the groundwork for that, I think we've all seen a change in culture. I'm closer to 40 now, so I've even seen a change in culture from when I was in college versus now, right? And I joke that my students keep me young because I'm constantly around young energy, and I feel like I have to keep up and make sure that I'm actually relevant to them, right? So with that being said, I have a lot of close relationships with students, and to me, one thing's clear: they, for the most part, do not want to have to bring a separate person to work that they actually are at home, right? Like everyone wants to bring their whole self to work. They want to feel like they can be who they are and be part of the team. And there's a statistic that suggests millennials, so my generation and younger, but millennials specifically, feel most engaged. Like 83% of millennials said they feel most engaged in an environment that they feel like is inclusive. So I don't think people have an option anymore to just sit back and not worry about these things.
Yeah.
So with that being said, there's also the idea that a lot of people are trying to take an all or nothing approach. They feel like they have to, do huge initiatives to, completely rehaul things. And that may work for some companies, depending on your size and your resources. But I think there's a lot of just small things that sales managers, regardless of what your company's doing, that could be doing to influence diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives specifically within your team. So do you want me to talk about a few of those?
Yeah, I'd love to hear
Okay,
some of those
awesome.
examples, because I think that's the
Awesome.
stuff that as people hear, it's like,
Yeah.
okay, you know what? When they can see
hmm
themselves as being able to apply some things, because I agree with you that the topic today is talked about. You don't have an option. I do think there's people out there going, okay, well, what does this look like for me?
hmm Absolutely. So I'll give you just a few little tidbits. I do full week-long workshops on this, so we could go all day on this, but I'll give you some maybe small changes that I think a lot of managers or sales folks can make today that are not too hard to do. So let's just start at the very beginning with recruiting and hiring. I mean, obviously, I think a lot of people need to think outside the box in regarding where they're getting students from. So, recruit from colleges, recruit from historically Black colleges, recruit from organizations that specifically are around identity topics, LGBTQIA communities, those sorts of things, right? But at a more specific level, something that I think is really low hanging fruit is a lot of hiring decisions are still made with gut instinct. Whether we like it or not, there's a rule, right? 30 seconds. Within 30 seconds and 30 feet, we have made our decision. And at that point, we are seeking out information that just confirms what we've already decided.
Yeah.
So 30 seconds and 30 feet, the candidates walked in and I've said, yep, I like them. I like their vibe. I think they're going to do well on the team. But we know that our implicit biases, those biases that we're not aware of, right? They really kick in right then. And that's how we make those decisions, is heuristics and implicit bias. So with that being said, to try to kind of, calm down with the biases and to try to really check our biases, I think something simple a lot of people could do is build out a rubric or build out a ideal candidate. So before you see anybody, what would that candidate's experience look like? What would that candidate's maybe industries they're in look like? Because what that's going to allow you to do is have okay, in my mind, I wanted a candidate that has 4 years of experience. It would be awesome if they worked in this industry. It would be awesome if they knew this, knew that, right? That's going to give you kind of a check for whenever someone comes in and you're really loving them or really not loving them, to go, okay, so let me step back a little bit and ask myself why. Because we like people like ourselves. We all
Yeah.
know this. Like, we know the whole in group out group stuff, right? Like, I have my in group, and anybody outside of that I'm not going to like as much normally. But it's detrimental for financial outcomes in sales teams. It's detrimental, I think, for innovation and creativity. So having that your own, and yeah, you could use kind of the posting if you want, but a lot of times, those are created by HR or created
Yeah.
at a higher level. But you, as a hiring manager, can have your wish list that will at least check you to look at it and go, wow, this person doesn't have any of this. Okay, let's ask myself why I really want to hire them, right? So simple things like that. Also, moving forward, if you think about culture and like when you do hire, after you hire and you have a team, simple things like lazy language. So lazy language in the sense of a perfect one that we all know is we all say, hey guys. And I always joke with my students, like, how would it feel if I walked into a room full of different individuals and said, hey girls? It'd be bizarre, right?
Yeah.
But hey guys has become normal to us, normal vernacular. However, we know that for a lot of people, that is an automatic trigger to feel like, oh, okay, I'm not part of this group.
I was going to say, it sounds like a I don't belong here thing that you
Yeah,
could get to pretty quickly.
yeah, exactly. Or even words such as that's normal, they're normal versus it's typical, right? Normal, you're suggesting that if you're not normal, then right? Like,
Yeah.
so
Yeah. You
so
are
there's a lot of,
abnormal.
yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of lazy language that I think people use that can, for certain types of people, be, feeling like you're excluded from the situation. And I think also whenever you specify, so I use "hey folks" a lot, and everybody jokes that like, oh, you sound like my grandfather. I don't care. I'm okay with that. But I say "hey folks" a lot. I say people, hey everybody. Right? There's a lot of other options. I could go on and on about language, but I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to just reconsider our language. And also educate ourselves on language. So a specific example. Now, when you talk about DEI, let me sidebar just a little bit. Um, I think race, ethnicity, and gender are some of the identities that come to people's mind first. But we're talking about a lot of folks, right? We're talking about parenting roles. We're talking about people living with disabilities. We're talking about veteran status. We're talking about all sorts of identities that people bring to work. I think a lot of times we talk about these identities and use our language very loosely. So, for example, the difference between racism versus prejudice, right? Like, just look up those definitions so that when you're choosing the word exactly what you're saying. I think a lot of language, a lot of lazy language can cause a lot of communication issues between team members, can cause a lot of division. So that's a simple fix, right? And then maybe let's move one step further to evaluation and feedback. So evaluation and feedback is another area where I would suggest that managers and sales folks that evaluate anybody have an actual checklist of making sure that they're evaluating everyone the same. There's research that suggests that women usually get feedback on soft skills, how they are as a person, whether they're likable, whether they're friendly, whereas men, and in this case, they just use kind of traditional two gender binary roles. But men tend to get feedback that is about projects that they've done, about specific tasks that they've completed. And the problem there is, first, it's not equal in the sense of you should be providing, I would argue, both to all of the genders. But also, what do you really do with soft skills? Like, there's only so much you can work on there as who you are as a person. Whereas if you tell me, like, you really thought I did a great job on a certain project, moving forward what your strengths are, and you kind of have like a direction to progress in your career and to develop. So having a laid out structure of like how you do evaluations to make sure that everybody's getting evaluated on the exact same elements across all your sales team.
Yeah, those are great suggestions, like practical steps too. I like in both cases, like evaluation or even in hiring, I like how you kind of created this rubric. Obviously, being in education,
Yeah.
anytime you think of anything, it's always like, okay, I need the rubric to make sure that I have, you have the guidelines on how you're going to evaluate something. People want to know how they're going to be evaluated on. Yet you go out into the real world and there aren't a lot of rubric mindsets applied to things. So I think that is really helpful. I mean, if you had to give like the sales manager, the salesperson in a company kind of one piece of advice on, certainly leaning in as the world is leaning in, maybe more than leaning in, but leading as you evolve to get, more diversity, equity, inclusion just a part of, your organization, what would be the one thing that you might suggest that they do?
Sure. So it is going to be the most obvious, but still the most missed and most critical is education. I think that a lot of people, have to work in the space or need to work in the space or want to work in the space, but they're not willing to put the time in prior to really do some education and self-reflection. What is awesome is there's a ton of material. I don't even necessarily mean that workshops need to be, I mean, I think those are great because I think a lot of this type of content is best learned in a co-learning situation.
Yeah.
So I do think that's very valuable, but literally reading, listening, if you're not a reader, podcast, right? Like there's all kinds of different ways to educate yourself. Because even myself, but it's an evolution, right? I'm never going to know everything. I'm not even going to be close. I just have to consistently spend the time to educate myself to make sure that as things evolve, as culture evolves, as structures evolve, that I understand what's happening and informed enough to at least have a conversation about it. I think a lot of people feel like they have to be a perfect expert in this area before they say anything. I disagree because if that's true, none of us are ever going to say anything.
Yeah.
But I also think there's the other side, a lot of folks that feel like they can say a lot and have zero education about it. So that nice middle, right? You don't have to be a perfect expert, but you do need to show that you're engaged in trying to educate yourself in this area. There's tons of awesome books on, there's one specifically called Your Blind Spot. It's on implicit bias. White Fragility is specifically, I think, a good book for people who identify as white that want to start thinking about race and ethnicity topics. So there's I can provide a whole list of resources if anybody wants them, different ways to be educated about it. But it really is so simple. It's a want to be a part of the conversation and a willingness to invest some time to educate yourself so that you can have informed conversations and have open dialogue with your team members.
Yeah. That's great, Lisa. I appreciate you sharing that. I think the insight certainly that you provide, but then the practical recommendations really can be meaningful to people. So it does bring us to the end of our show. Always my time where I'm like, oh man, but this has been a great conversation. I just want to thank you for being willing to participate, to tackle these topics. It was great.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much.